If you're interested in what I look like in real life and want to learn more about me, then follow my Instagram page at Joe the Insomniac. Hello everyone. I bought one of them Chinese solar powered wavy cat things. Now I live in England, so I thought there's no chance it'd ever go off, but I just realised after doing all my recordings that he's been doing it the whole time. So sorry if you can hear a little clicky sound in the background. He's cool though. It's a little cat. Do your thing, bro. And with that out of the way, let's get to the stories. This story isn't all that insane like a lot of other stories, but deeply unnerving to me. I was about 10, as a club scout. Every year to raise money, my troop sold popcorn, usually door to door. A leader, or one of our parents, would usually follow us in the car and drive us to different neighbourhoods, so we're not completely alone while doing this. Often though, there weren't enough volunteers to come along, so the adult would wait at the end of the street and check up on us every half hour or so. I knocked on the door of this house near the woods. A woman answered the door, but didn't come out fully. Instead, she cracked the door open and looked at me and spoke to me through the crack. This wasn't particularly odd, as most people weren't sure what we're doing there at first. But the way she looked at me through the door was different. I somehow didn't notice anything at the time, but her face was only half exposed and completely horizontal, which meant she was standing completely behind the door for some reason. I started going through my standard sales pitch, going on about supporting the troop and on how high our quality popcorn is. But she stopped me in a low voice and said, "Oh dear, why don't you come inside and tell me more about this?" Thankfully, I was a big fan of scary stories as a kid, so alarm bells began ringing. I asked her why she didn't come outside fully, and her reply is in the same tone. "I have cancer, I can't." Now I didn't know much about cancer back then, but it didn't sound like a symptom to me. Before I could say anything else, she said, "Are you alone? Are you with anyone else?" I replied that the Cub Scout leader was down the street, and as soon as she heard that, she shut the door and locked it without a sound. I was about 8 or 9 years old when this happened, placing it around 2005 or 6. At the time I was living in Southwest Florida with my mum in a not so great part of town. So one day, my mum is driving me to a scout meeting for girls through the forest. I'm in the rear driver's side seat directly behind my mum. We're at a busy intersection in the turn lane waiting for the light to turn green for us to make a right. This guy comes running down the middle of the road, like literally running between cars on the main road. He's screaming, "Help! Help me please." My mum sees him in the rearview mirror on her side, and although she's in a good place to be a kind person, she's also cautious, so cracks down her window maybe 4 or 5 inches to see what's wrong, thinking maybe he's gotten into a car accident or something. Guy comes running up to my mother's window, shoves his arm into the car, almost up to his elbow. He's obviously trying to open the door or hit the power locks or windows to get in. My mum, being the badass she is, punches the crap out of this guy. And you can hear a pop and a crack sound. She must have broken at least one of his fingers. She rolls the windows up, crushing his fingers and more bones than I ever thought you could in an arm. Meanwhile, I'm in the backseat, petrified to move. He starts beating on the window, saying we better let him in or he's going to kill us. At this point, the light turns green, and as soon as the car in front of us turned, my mum burned rubber to get out of there. We make it to the location for the scout meeting. By this time, I'm no longer in shock and start freaking out. I start crying a bit, but everything's okay. My mum calls the police department to let them know what happened, and we fled the scene. The officer informs her that someone's been robbed not even a block away from the intersection we're at. The suspect had fled on foot and eventually was caught, but the officer assumed that the man who tried to break into our car was the same one. At the time, I didn't think too deep into it. As I've got older, I started to think about it and just how dangerous it was. What if he was able to get in? What if he hurt my mum or me? What if he pulled out on my mum's driver's seat and drove away, or maybe had a weapon? Last summer, I was camping with my partner and our 30-pound dog alone in a creek in a popular area in a nearby national forest. It was an established site, but not a campground. Parking spot, fire ring, nice flat area with access to the creek. Now in the dead of night, we're awoken by a large truck parked by our car just idling. Eventually 3 men get out. They enter our camp. They're talking quietly. The truck and creek makes us unable to hear anything they're saying. I'm pretty sure it's not good now. Meanwhile, our dog has been growling in a low tone the entire time. Early on, I whispered to my partner to be quiet and hold the dog and hide. I got out of our sleeping bag, put my shoes on. The only thing I had for defense was a forest axe, halfway between a hatchet and axe. Very useful for getting by in the woods. I had a leather sheath with a metal button latch to protect the blade. Now they took their time, perhaps as intimidation, but eventually got closer to our tent. I loudly popped the metal button for the latch, taking the sheath off, preparing to become an axe murderer. Or maybe be murdered myself, apparently. All 3 of the men hear the latch. My assumption is they thought it's a gun holster, quickly left the camp, getting in their trucks and leaving without a word. I grew up in a small coal town in the Appalachian Mountains. On the side of one of the mountains that borders the valley of the town, it's a lovely place for an outdoorsy kid. We have no immediate neighbours and acres of woods to play in. Above our house was a ridge that ran along the border of a state park, but all the trails and public areas were far in the valley below, separated by a thick forest with plenty of no trespassing signs. So, we very rarely had hikers crossing over onto our land. From our home, there was a dirt road that wound up the mountainside to the top of the ridge. Where there stood the remains of a burnt down cabin. From there, you could follow the ridge to a flat area with Dad's hunting friends, one of whom posted a trail cam to monitor off-season activity. From there, you could continue up the ridge to a clearing that hosted lots of flat boulders and a giant electric tower that was fun to climb on. I'd venture up there often with the family's black Labrador, spending hours reading, climbing and enjoying nature. One early fall day when I was 13, I headed up there with a backpack full of snacks and a book. I'd taken care to avoid the trail cam, as it was the old film variety, and I gotten in trouble for accidentally filling entire rolls with me goofing around in the area. I reached my favourite rock at the edge of the clearing near the power lines, and just settled down to read when Felicia started to bark and growl aggressively. At first, I paid no attention to it, as she loves to chase deer, but this time, she didn't bound off into the woods after her quarry. Instead, she snuck up next to me growling at something unseen in the thick tangle of brush and trees on the steep mountainside that faces a park. Now, I'd consider hiking down that way into the park on occasion, but it wasn't an easy passage. The area had been cleared years before to install an electrical tower, and in its place had grown a thick mass of barbs and weeds. The rocks that were made great for climbing are on top of the ridge. Not to mention, there was much easier access closer to the park entrance. This brought you down to an undeveloped area at the very back of the campgrounds that wasn't easily accessible to cars or hikers. So I was taken off guard to see a man fighting his way through the brush in that direction. Nervously I called out hello, gripped Felicia's collar. She had a tendency to jump on people when she gets excited, and I didn't want to tumble her down the mountain. I'd overheard my parents arguing about lawsuits when she borrowed a jogger over the trail park. The man smiles, coughs, and makes his way up the hill to the base of my rock. I don't know if it was Felicia's reaction to him, or the rather remote and impassable way that he'd come from, but his presence made me uneasy. He seemed normal and friendly enough. He was probably in his mid to late 20s, average height and build. Rather unremarkable looking. No backpack or supplies, but he was dressed as a hiker would be. He didn't like the way he looked at me, although, in my young age, I couldn't place why it unsettled me. As a grown woman, I can look back and realize how he was sizing me up. He had a big smile on his face too. Hi there. Where'd you come from? No trace of an accent. Sticking out to me as odd. Our people have a strong regional accent, and we don't get any outsiders here. I live just down the hill. I was hiking with my dog. She seems like a nice dog, he told me, with no trace of irony. Felicia starts snarling and vibrating with menace, but he seems unfazed. Weird again. You should have her on a leash though, you don't want to get in trouble. I say we put her on a leash and we're down in the park, but this is our property. No reaction to learning he was essentially trespassing. Still, you're so close, you don't know who you might run up on here. I said no one comes up here, being a bit rude. He said I'm from the park, grinning. I'm one of the park rangers, and I wanted to see the property. What would you have done if she'd attacked me? You get in big trouble. At this time, I'm immediately chilled. We only had one ranger, and he was a close friend of the family. This guy was not him. But I was afraid to let on that I knew he was lying, so I dug out Felicia's collar and clipped her on the leash. Sorry, we'll let you get on with the hike, I have to go home, he says. Your parents know you're up here. Oh yeah, they expect me home soon. Do they often come here? Well, my dad does. He comes up to check on the trail cams. Trail cams? Yeah, there's loads up here. He smiled but looks cold. Well, these would make excellent hunting grounds. He took a step towards me and Felicia lunged. nearly yanking the leash out of my hands. I managed to haul her back in time. His smile was gone. "You should head back," I say, keeping a tight hold on the leash. "Now, maybe I'll see you up here again sometime." "Yeah, maybe," I said, secretly thinking to myself that I'd never step foot in the woods again. "Well, bye." I quickly dragged Felicia away, looking back over my shoulder every now and then. He remains motionless in the spot where I'd left him, staring after me with that same smile. Once he was out of sight, I picked up the pace. Felicia growled over her shoulder a few times, and occasionally I heard branches snap behind me, but glancing back, I saw no sign of him following. I cut straight across the clearing with the trail cam, not bothering to avoid it in my rush to get away from the stranger. Once we hit the road that led home, I unclipped Felicia from the leash and broke into a jog. She remained by my side until I got home. I didn't mention the strange man to my parents at first. They're very wary of me going hiking alone, and I knew I wouldn't be let out if I said it. By the time I got home, I convinced myself that I'd overreacted to the whole thing. He's probably just a hiker and made up the bit about being a ranger to mess with me. Still, I didn't hike up to that ridge that week, instead sticking to the woods nearby. At the end of the week though, I came home from school to an annoyed dad demanding to know if I'd messed with the trail cam. His buddy had actually come up to collect the film, discovering the cameras switched off, with a few frames taken off. At first I was only concerned with getting in trouble and desperately professed innocence, and then I remembered the stranger. After telling Dad about him, he calls the park ranger to ask if there was a new ranger we didn't know about. He said no, but after hearing my story, he told Dad the campground attendant who caught an out-of-stater overnighting in an unauthorized area back behind the campgrounds a previous weekend. He'd assumed the guy was trying to get out of paying the fee. Young guy, average looking, overly friendly. He said it was a mistake and took off. Shortly after, we heard from Dad's buddy with the trail cam. He got on the roll developed, even though there's only a few frames still filled up. The last one is of me and Felicia cutting across the clearing. Thank God I told the stranger there's multiple cams. I imagine he'd given up after locating the other ones. My parents have since moved into a little snug neighborhood down in the valley. I moved out of town. In my parents' backyard, on the river, there's a mountain covered by Easter lilies that marks Felicia's final resting place. The house I grew up in fell into despair and was sold and essentially burned to the ground. No one lives there now, but the clearing at the top is still popular with hunters. When I visit, I still hike up that ridge and always bring a dog with me. It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I are in the middle of a crossroad trip. We're driving through Texas. Now, for any of you who have driven through Texas, you would have known how big the state actually is. Sometimes you'll go hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass through didn't consist of very much. Maybe an old rusty petrol station, a few little houses. Looking out the window, you'd swear you're driving through the same desert over and over again. I actually started getting a headache, and my husband suggested I took a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colours of a desert sunset. The slang of the car awoke in me. Now, the first thing I noticed is the beautiful colours of a desert sunset. The swaying of the car woke me up, and the first thing I noticed is how dark it is. I believe it's around 10 PM. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a shop. He told me he was going to grab us some food, asking if I needed to pee. Knowing I might not have another chance for quite a while when I went to the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and women's restrooms are a little down the hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired and realised how badly I need to pee. So I shuffled into the restroom, made my way the short distance from the door to the nearest 2 stalls. I then make eye contact with a woman coming out of the other stall. She doesn't look quite homeless, but she was definitely a mess. Her hair was wild and grey, almost shoulder length if I hadn't been looking carefully. It looked as though she hadn't seen a brush for months. She wore ragged looking clothes, a pair of ill-fitting blackout shorts, and I remember noticing her foam flip-flops. She has several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind this is Texas in July. The jacket is hanging out over her shoulders like she hadn't taken it off properly. She was carrying something in a tied up grocery bag. I gave her a quick smile as our eyes met. She just stares at me in return. Then the face turns wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as though she's angry, but her eyes looked alive and wild. She looked at me like she's hungry. This made me feel that something was wrong with her. I try and brush it off. She waddled over to the only sink and I took my time shutting the door because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd. She was standing with her body angled towards me, but her face was turned to the mirror. Her body was tensed, legs slightly crouched as though she's ready to act. Her hands were not up by her face, like you would be at a mirror. I wasn't sure why, but I felt uncomfortable. Now I regretted leaving my purse and things away from me with my cell phone in it. I shut the door, locking the stall behind me using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I left the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I waited longer. Finally I heard the smacking of her flip-flops on her way to the door. I heard it open and slam close. The door was pretty heavy, having actually slammed the same way when I entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed a wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock, then paused. Fingers only inches away from the lock. I'm now silent as I can manage to be, and yes, I hear breathing. The woman pretended to leave. At this point I was scared and confused. Why she tried to trick me into thinking she had left, only to stick around and be as quiet as possible. I knew something was wrong, so I stayed in the store even longer. This time it must have been about 20 minutes. I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction her breathing was coming from. She positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see her. Finally I hear her leave. This time I waited a few minutes to make sure she hadn't tried her trick again. I slipped out of the stall quickly, washing my hands and rushing down the hallway to the store. It's pitch black outside. I had no idea where she was. She couldn't be far. A large man was checking out the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store and quietly slipped out behind the door. Sure enough, crouched right outside of the door is the woman, surprised as she stands and turns away to the side of the store, walking quickly. My husband's waiting in the car and says am I okay, as I took a while. I said I'd say about it when we got away from the store. Easily the most scary experience of my life.